Before we introduce our speakers, Kathleen M. Bloomfield, President of the Association of Jewish Libraries, will join us to say a few words. Kathy?
Thanks, Suzanne. I just want to say hello to everyone who's come today, including all of the AJL members who I see on the list. It is our pleasure and we're thrilled to be co-sponsoring this event, and we hope this will be only the first in a number of such events that Moment Magazine and AJL will be co-sponsoring. So today's event promises to be wonderful, and I turn it back over to Suzanne to get us kicked off.
Thank you, Kathleen. Moment is thrilled to be co-sponsoring today's event with the Association of Jewish Libraries. Now for today's program. Abraham Riesman is a Rhode Island-based journalist and author, including that of his most recent book, True Believer, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. He was on staff at New York Magazine for 7 years and has also published work in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, and the New Republic, among other outlets. Dan Raviv is the author of books about Israeli espionage and diplomacy, including Spies Against Armageddon and Every Spy a Prince, plus Comic Wars, an account of how Marvel Comics went bankrupt but was turned into a movie powerhouse by 2 Israeli Americans. He was a CBS News correspondent in Israel, Europe, and Washington for 40 years, and then senior DC correspondent for Israel's I-24 News. Please welcome Abraham Riesman and Dan Raviv.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I obviously was really fascinated to read this book. Right, this is the one we're talking about. You see Abraham Riesman as well, the author of this book, The Rise and Fall of Stan Lee. Stan Lee, of course, was, well, the biggest creative force at Marvel Comics for decades. And it certainly was in the news when he died in 2018. He was nearly 96 years old when he passed away. So he was blessed with a long life. But was he blessed with a good life? He certainly entertained a lot of people. But I was talking to Abraham Riesman, the author, a short time ago, and I said, the story of his old age, it's often thought of as a disaster in elder care. That Stan Lee was not well taken care of. He was manipulated in all sorts of ways. Who got his money? That's about 1/3 of the book. The last 1/3, but the first 2/3 is a lot more fun when it comes to his life and a story of success, without doubt. As for why my interest, well, not just having been a comic book reader when I was a kid, but this is the book that I wrote, Comic Wars, which was largely about how Marvel Comics went bankrupt in the late 1990s and came out of bankruptcy and reshaped itself as a movie-making company. And a lot of people in our audience will think of Marvel that way, no question about it.
Great book, by the way, everybody. It was, I just want to let everyone know.
Well, thank you, Abraham. A battle for Marvel Comics. And Abraham, a lot of people have asked me whether this, I'm the typical story of a suburban Jewish guy up in Great Neck, Long Island, where I must add lots and lots of comic books, and then my parents threw them away when they cleaned out the house. I'm sure you've heard of that kind of disaster.
Oh, yeah. Half of the interviews I've done, either conducted or had done with me, are with boomers recalling how they had, a great comics collection that, whoa, we got you in stereo. All right. Anyway, yes.
So you didn't have that disaster? You didn't have comics?
My comics are intact. I'm actually hoping to ship them from my mother's house because I finally am a homeowner and therefore have a basement where I can put all my old comics. But, that'll be a big deal for me. I haven't seen a lot of those comics in a good long while. But
okay, and then people ask Marvel or DC, right? Stan Lee was at Marvel Comics. DC was the one with Superman, Batman, Justice League of America, Wonder Woman, Aquaman. Yeah. Especially at my age, we thought of Marvel as being Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, but these days people say the Avengers, X-Men, Iron Man. But anyway, which ones did you read?
Me? I'm a child of the 90s when it comes to my comics preferences. I started reading comics, reading licensed Dark Horse comics about the Star Wars the franchise, and then later graduated to Marvel. And it was really the X-Men that spoke to me when I was a kid. I'm not alone in that. That was partially because there's something fascinating and rich in both the concept as originally conceived and as sort of revamped by later creators, but also just because that was what was getting pushed as of then. So that was, if you were reading Marvel, you were reading X-Men comics, and that was kind of my gateway point.
Well, tell me, as you investigated Stan Lee's life, tell me how true is it, something that he often claimed, that absolutely intentionally, and he was a writer, by the way, not the artist. He was not the one who drew the comic books.
Right.
But he always said that what was special about his superheroes, you like that name, is that they were ordinary folks with ordinary problems.
That they had
and
feet of
Stan
clay.
sincerely believed that would be appealing. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Did he think that would be appealing?
Well, I was wondering if you found that that was absolutely sincere in how he saw.
Oh, and how he approached them. Sure. Well, I mean, yes. I if you read the comics, you'll see, he especially back in the 60s when he was co-writing these comics, there's a real emphasis on the degree to which these characters are, have real problems. They're superheroes with super problems, as a famous headline about them put it back in the day. And not only was that in the content, and of course, we can get into the questions of who's really responsible for the content, et cetera, when he was promoting these things, and he had a tremendous gift for promotion, self and company, that was what he would emphasize. Very often, that was the main talking point in a given interview. He would say, especially in the 60s, he would be on the radio or wherever he was and saying, look, these are heroes with feet of clay. This is not like the superheroes you remember when you were a child, is the emphasis when he says something like that.
Any particular reason that he didn't care for Superman and Batman?
Well, this is, I think, yes, he didn't particularly like comics, is the funny thing about Stan. He did not, you can see him on record in private, or there are videos and audio recordings of him saying that, he didn't read comics that he wasn't making, basically. So he did not grow up a fan of comic books, mainly because comic books didn't really exist in his childhood, or at least superhero comics didn't. But that said, he wanted to make something that he thought could be real literature. And that was something that was really important to him. He always wanted to do more than comics, but within the context of comics, he wanted to at least present himself as somebody who was putting out serious fiction. And that
is a consistent theme in your book, that he wanted to do serious fiction. He tried several times.
A lot of times
with other stuff.
Yeah, Stan, throughout his career, going back, the earliest attempts I can find were in 1945, after he got out of World War II. He tried to start a textbook company with Bennett Cerf of Random House. The irony, of course, is my book is published by Penguin Random House. But as early as then, when he was, just in his 20s, and had been in the comic book industry prior to the war for only, a couple of years, he's already trying to get out. He wanted to do something else, something that was more legit. And of course, in the 50s, that becomes even more of a concern because there's this huge moral panic about comic books in the mid 50s. So the idea of being a comic book writer or editor, which, he was both, that was something to be looked down upon. So, but what's fascinating is even as late as, well, kind of his entire life, but even within the context of Marvel, as late as like 1963, when these comics had been a big growing hit for 2 years, he was still trying to do other projects at Marvel that he saw as being either more lucrative or more serious. And what's fascinating about Stan is the more he tried to do that, the more his legacy was solidified as just being the guy who wrote superhero comics and the guy who allegedly created the characters. But yes, go ahead.
Well, and twice you've alluded to whether he deserves the full credit, and we will get to that. And you really dove into that controversy. If you know anything about the comic book world, whether Stan Lee deserved all the credit that he got or took. But first, fill us in on what were your main sources of information? Here you were digging into the life of someone who recently died.
Well, the big treasure trove was his personal archive at the University of Wyoming, of all places. Long story short, in the early 80s, the University of Wyoming reached out to Stan and asked if he wanted to commit to donating his papers and other archival materials to their American Heritage Center, which is a series of archives for American cultural figures. And in the 80s, in the early 80s, Stan was kind of in a bit of a lull, and there weren't a whole lot of people knocking on his door asking for his archives. So because they asked, he was intrigued and apparently said yes because Jack Benny's archives were also in there. So anyway, if you go to Laramie, Wyoming, which is very difficult to reach, all things considered, I guess you can make it work, but you can go into the American Heritage Center and just look at, there's about 200 boxes. I think it's something like 196 boxes worth of materials from Stan's life that he donated throughout his life up until about 2011. That was tremendously, I mean, we can get into details of stuff I found there, but that was tremendously important. And then there were a few key interviews that happened, or, documents that I uncovered that really augmented the story. A big one was my interview with Larry Lieber, a series of interviews with Larry Lieber, Stan's brother, who had not talked about any of this stuff at any length. And I'll forever be very grateful to Larry for his generosity with his time and his memories.
Yeah, by the way, not just the brother who wasn't in the business. If you see the amazing Spider-Man comic strip in the newspaper every day and on
Lieber,
Sunday, yeah, it usually says by Stan Lee and Larry Lieber. Stan was born Stanley Lieber, by the way.
Yeah, sorry, we should have said that. Yeah.
And so wow. And this is the less famous brother who did make a living out of the comic strip for the newspapers. And so, his more successful brother helped.
Made a living just barely. I mean, I've been to his apartment, and it's the size of a matchbox. It's on the Upper East Side, but it's rent controlled, and he's been there since 1968. I mean, he and his brother didn't share a lot, both in terms of talking to each other all that much about things that were important, but also personality trait wise, there was a lot of divergence between the two of them. But that said, Larry had an enormous resource when it came to information, not just about Stan's early life, but just sort of, the contours of a person that only a family member can see.
For instance, this being Moment Magazine, let's go to the Jewish
end. Go to the Jewish end. Yes, I'm all for it.
Right. The Lieber family was a Jewish family. In fact, Stan Lee's parents were immigrants from Romania.
Refugees, really. There was a horrible wave of anti-Semitism of legal anti-Semitism in the late 19th century into the early 20th, specifically the decade, the first 1899 to about 1909, 1910 was this particularly acute period of anti-Semitic legislation and, parastate problems. And so, Stan's parents, Yanku Ern Lieber and Celia Solomon, who were both from Eastern Romania. Sorry, I'm from Ukraine. From Eastern Romania, although they didn't know each other there, both happened to end up in New York and encountered each other at some point. I don't have details on that, and ended up having this family. But theirs was a really Jewish story, as was that of the comic book industry in general. I mean, Stan got this job at what became Marvel Comics through a family connection. I mean, it was his cousin-in-law who was the publisher of the place. And it was the comic book industry in its early days was largely run, like Hollywood, was largely run by Jewish men, either first or second generation immigrants. And Stan was no exception to that. And the fascinating thing is Stan really walked away from Jewish identity. He wanted no part of it. As soon as he was able to make his own decisions, he had a bar mitzvah, and his dad was very serious about being Jewish. But once Stan was making his own calls, he married an Episcopalian English woman. He had his daughter baptized. at his wife's behest. You know, that led to a lot of tension between him and his father. Yanku Ern then became Jack Lieber when he was in America. And, you know, Larry told me about how Jack would write him and his brother these letters, like really ripping into them for not being Jewish enough, basically. You know, especially Stan. He was very upset with Stan marrying outside of the Jewish group and baptizing his daughter. And he would write these letters saying that he, you know, wasn't doing enough for the state of Israel and he wasn't celebrating the holidays and so on and so forth. And it was, the Jewish factor was very important in Stan's life, despite the fact that he didn't want to really be associated with it at all.
Well, but you've suggested in your book that a theme about Stan Lee's behavior is often wanting to walk away from things, wanting to exit. And so you have the Jewish culture, if you will. Oh, by the way, there's an interview that you found, I guess, where he's asked, what is it about? Where you know, where's the Judaism in you, etc., as a Jewish New Yorker? And his answer was only like, "Well, I'm a New Yorker."
I'm a New Yorker, exactly. Well, that was from my brief sort of interview with him, which was, I got to email him some questions when he was still alive back when I was writing a profile of him in 2015. And I asked him, what did his experience as a Jewish New Yorker do to influence his work, he thinks. And he wrote back a couple of sentences, and it was like, well, New York has a real vibrancy, and I've always felt that New York was one of the characters in my stories, and just the Jewish part may as well have not been asked. In all the interviews and writings of Stan Lee that I've seen, which of course is not complete, who knows, I'm sure there's plenty of things that I've never seen. I did not, but I've seen a lot. I did not see him other than one interview. Never did he talk about himself as being Jewish, like even use the word. He said in like 2005, he did an interview where he said, Jewish people, and I include myself in that, think a certain way. And other than that, it just, he didn't want to be identified that way. In his autobiography, there's a moment where he is talking about trying to adopt along with his Episcopalian wife, and how they couldn't do it because it was an intermarriage. But the way he describes it being an intermarriage is, my wife is Episcopalian and my parents were Jewish. Ooh. Not that he was Jewish, my parents were Jewish. And it's very pointed. I mean, he wrote introduction. I could keep going, but anyway, the point is, his relationship to Judaism and the Jewish community was fraught. You know?
Okay, well, there are a couple of directions I'm going to go. I'll go one that goes sort of later in his life with that, because as Suzanne mentioned, my book is about two Israeli Americans taking over the company. And so, but on the other hand, I'm thinking that all the people who manipulated the company, Ronald Perlman of Revlon being the owner for a while, Carl Icahn going for it, and others, Jewish.
They're all Jewish men. I know. That's the craziest thing. I say that in the book where I'm like, although he walked away from the Jewish world wanted him. I mean, in some ways, like they're all but down to his personal relationships. I mean, these were different varieties of Jewish men, but they were all Jewish men. I mean, you had, or not all, but a lot of them. For example, Peter Paul, who I'm sure you're going to ask about later at some point, so I won't spoiler too much of it, but his longtime friend and business associate with whom he ran a company into the ground was Jewish. And it's just, I don't know what to make of that exactly. I didn't make a big deal out of it in the book because I didn't want to sound anti-Semitic. But for whatever reason, I leave that up to the reader to maybe deduce. There's a preponderance of Jewish men in Stan's story.
Well, you got the right audience for it in our Moment magazine.
I did for Moment magazine, yes. So
as a matter of fact, let's come back to your understanding of all those early comic book writers, like the creators of Superman, people at DC Comics, therefore, Jews who had changed their names, tried to become American. What do you think there is to it?
It's such a tough question because I think Michael Chabon's right. I think there is a lot to explore in that. And I'm sure to some degree, the idea of passing of a secret identity of, these unbelievably Anglo-Saxon rock hard American names like Clark Kent and Bruce Wayne, who knows? there's some degree to which maybe the Jewish experience, broadly speaking, influenced the way these characters went. But I feel like the bigger thing that's interesting, because that you can't pin down, it's hard to prove something like that. But what really animates me is the idea of this Jewish milieu out of which the comic book industry is emerging as a business. You have these Jewish businessmen who are excluded from, it's like any number of other stories of Jewish business successes. There's an industry that they can get into because it's low grade and despised. First, it's publishing like pulps and nudies and smooshes and all this stuff, and then it becomes comic books. And they're dominated by kinship networks as well. I mean, it's Jewish men hiring other Jewish men, usually, or at least very often, Jewish men they're related to. I would be going off on a tangent if I gave you all of my theories about how that influenced things, but it certainly did lead to Stan Lee's story being able to happen because of that approach to kinship networks and business when he was coming up. So anyway,
all right, but more than anything, and I think it comes out, in your book as well, it's the force of personality that this man also talented. I mean,
sure. I'm just saying that's how he gets his foot in the door is through that. But yeah,
and then you have to deliver, as every immigrant group in the U.S., as every up and coming ethnic
everyone
racial
finds,
group knows, right, get your foot in the door, and then you got to deliver. When it comes to Stan Lee, when I met him, researching for my book and beyond that, when I met him, a self-promoter. I mean, he was happy. He was almost always happy, but he was always talking about his latest project, his latest thing. He just sort of wouldn't stop. A big talker, very amusing, very charming.
Sure.
But right, again and again, people told you that, right? He'd come up with an idea and then he kind of wouldn't let go. And in a moment, we'll get to the accusation that he even stole people's ideas. But what do you think of his talent? Is it mainly his salesmanship? Or what a creative.
Well, sure. I mean, I think the thing that sets him apart, and that from other comic book creators is his acumen for self-promotion. You can get into arguments about how creative he was, but there were a lot of creative people. What he could do that others couldn't, and that's what really led to a lot of his success, was he was very good at selling himself and selling his product. In a lot of ways, he anticipated some of the ways that the influencer economy works today, where it's like you have a product, but you want to have people coming back, not so much for thinking that they're coming back for the person, and then they end up buying the product. I mean, there were so many people who grew up reading Stan's letters pages in the 60s, who I would ask them, what did you love about the comics? And I was expecting them to say the art, the writing, whatever, and they would say the letters pages. Stan was writing these stories as far as they knew, but what really grabbed them was Stan talking to them directly, which he also did in the narration boxes as well, and sometimes even in the dialogue boxes.
Yeah, but there was a page. There was a page. I think Stan's soapbox.
Stan's soapbox. Well, it was Bullpen Bulletin's Stan's soapbox. It was sort of the back page was. And
he was communicating directly, which these days they tell anyone, whether in entertainment or in news broadcasting, you want to make that connection with your audience. Don't just deliver the product.
That's what I'm saying. Exactly. This anticipates a lot. I mean, and don't think I haven't thought through the ridiculous ironies of having to be a self-promoter for this book about a self-promoter. But he was tremendously good at it, and it served him very well. He created this character called Stan Lee, right? I mean, the more you learn, and it doesn't take that much, you start chipping away and you start looking at things, and you find out that, the Stanley Martin Lieber, maybe we can call him, had a lot of distinct differences from the public presentation of Stan Lee.
By the way, the title of your book, True Believer, I think that came from one of his nicknames for Marvel fans.
Well, yes, he would say True Believers, face front True Believers, or just using True Believer elsewhere in a sentence.
Like they were a merry
Marvel marching
army.
society, exactly. Yeah. That they were the keepers of the flame. They were the you know,
And,
they
and
were
to
the
be and to be frank, in the competition, the Batman and Superman
distinguished
comics,
competition. Yeah.
I don't remember any attempted humor.
Well, there was humor, but it was Stan had a knack. I mean, what's funny is Stan didn't have that much of a knack for humor outside of comics, at least in terms of succeeding with it.
Yeah.
He doesn't really have any examples outside of comics and letters pages and such. Although he made many attempts, he is not regarded as a humorist outside of that world, or a humorist of renown. But within the comics, yeah, I mean, and a lot of that is stuff that you can only attribute to him because it was in the nature of the dialogue. And, you know, as we may get into the way these comics were being created, Stan was not the only writer of the plot, and sometimes not the writer of the plot at all, but he was always the writer of the dialogue and the narration. And a lot of the best gags come through in those mediums.
Okay, Abraham. So after 8 variegated references to maybe Stan wasn't
on the level about
credit.
what he said.
Yeah, didn't deserve as much credit as he took. You know, give us a general outline of what comic book fans often think of his battle against Steve Ditko for credit, or Jack Kirby versus Stanley.
Yeah. So the trouble is, Stan was not doing these comics alone. Stan could not draw. So Stan had to work with artists, and the two most notable artists he worked with were Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. And I call them artists. I should probably call them writer artists, because in both cases, they were writers, even independent of Stan. But then because of the workflow that they used with Stan, they were the co-writers of these comics. Now, what do I mean by that? The process was called the Marvel method. It was only called that later. They didn't call it that at the time. At the time, it was just this ad hoc arrangement that had in some ways been around since going back to at least the 50s and even the 40s. I have, you know, quotes of earlier creators talking about some variation on this, but basically what the Marvel method consisted of was there'd be a conversation between the writer and the artist, in this case, Stan, and then whoever he was working with. And again, I should say writer artist, because after that conversation, and it's unclear what would happen in that conversation, I'll get to that in a second, the writer artist would then go home. They were all freelancers by the 60s, and write the comic, just not with words, write it with pictures. Because from that conversation, by Stan's own admission, there were times, and the assertion by critics is that it was more than a few times, and maybe all the time, or not all the time, but a lot of the time, it would be somebody telling the writer artist telling him what the story is going to be, or Stan saying, I don't know what to put in this issue. What should we do? And then there were some times where it was much more of a conversation, or Stan had a more concrete idea. But after that ambiguous conversation, and these were not, at least in recordings or transcripts that still exist, these were not documented, or at least that we know about. So we don't know what happens in those conversations. All we know is the next thing that happens is the writer artist takes whatever amorphous things came out of that and writes the story. Then the writer artist gives it back to Stan, who, as the editor, would then, you know, say, we need to redo this, X, Y, and Z. And then when the art was in a place that he was happy with, and by the art, I mean, you know, the story, he would then write the dialogue and the narration that would be used, that would be printed in there by the letterer. And then and also do the letters pages. But the point is, with that Marvel method, no matter what, these comics were never being solely written by Stan, because he was not writing a full script. You know, that's the other way, the more intuitive way to do a comic. And the more common one these days is the writer, like a screenwriter, will just write a full script saying, here's what's happening. And then the artist goes, okay, well, I'm going to draw what's happening. And obviously there'll be some improvisation and dialogue, whatever, or back and forth. But, you know, there you can unambiguously say there's a writer and there's an artist. Well, with Stan, there were 2 writers and 1 artist. And that's where the problem lies, because, you know, these comics, because they were not being made solely by Stan, you also have to wonder who created the material that ends up becoming these comics. Who created the characters? These pieces of intellectual property, they're tremendously valuable now. The Avengers, the X-Men, you know, Spider-Man. Who was the person who came up with the stuff? Now, Stan always, not always, but throughout much of his career, portrayed himself, or at least allowed himself to be portrayed by his company and by journalists, etc., as the sole creator of everything, just minus the visuals. The visuals were always sort of secondary in importance in the way promotional materials went out and the way he spoke about things. I mean, he would praise his artists to high heaven, but it was never, up until very late in his life, it was never, I co-created these things. It was, I created them, and then the artists sort of gave them.
They would illustrate what he had created, his Spider-Man.
His ideas. And the trouble is that's not the narrative that his two main collaborators conveyed about what happened. So the two men I mentioned, Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby did most of this stuff with Stan. Jack Kirby had already created, along with this guy Joe Simon, Captain America back in the 30s, and then went on to to draw and co-write the comics that introduce, again, the Avengers, the X-Men. He allegedly had an initial idea for Spider-Man that looked very different from the final idea for Spider-Man. And indeed, Spider-Man was drawn by Steve Ditko, the aforementioned Steve Ditko. And Steve was also the sole creator of Doctor Strange, although Stan took credit for that. But that is more documentably, that was all Steve. So the question remains, after all that rambling, who created these things that matter so much to so many people and are worth so many American dollars?
Not that any of them cashed in with $1 billion.
No, God, no.
Marvel as a publisher always made sure it was work
for hire. Work for hire. Yes, the way they get you. I mean, the comics industry is terrible for labor, but that's a whole separate conversation. Or maybe it's not.
It wasn't. What do you think? What was it? I mean, you went through this debate in great depth, including people on both sides, but was it about credit?
It was about credit, but it was also about, eventually, well, here's the thing, work for hire, which meant theoretically, at least, that the company owned the intellectual property that you were creating. That until this copyright law from 1970 that was instituted in 1978 went into effect, work for hire was not very well defined. So there was always, it wasn't just for, credit being where credit was due. It was also that there was always a chance that Marvel or whoever owned Marvel could lose control of this IP if there was an effective legal assault from the Kirby camp, or Ditko, because and so that incentivized them to play nice with Stan, because Stan was, a good company man. Stan was actually an employee. These other guys were freelancers, which made the legal situation even more complicated. If Stan was the one coming up with this stuff, and Stan was willing to play ball when it came to work for hire and not rock the boat too much, then, everything was copacetic for Marvel. But there was always a chance. And in fact, there was a legal case with the Kirby estate. Kirby himself died in 94. There was this case that in 2014 almost made it to the Supreme Court. It was one step away from being actually heard by the Supreme Court, in which the Kirby estate was threatening to pull down the entire edifice of Marvel because they were asserting that, it's a complicated claim, but basically they were asserting that they held the copyright because of the vague nature of work for hire.
And by then the characters were multi-billion-dollar
right. By then they're huge, and Disney, which owned it by then, was pretty terrified, most likely, that this case might work out. So they settled for an undisclosed but surely enormous sum and an agreement to give greater credit to Kirby. And it's a complicated situation, and part of what I say in the book is we just don't have the answer. We're never going to know 100% for certain who created these characters, who created which character, how much was contributed, et cetera, et cetera. That stuff is just, we have to live with the ambiguity of it, which sucks.
Now, what happened that brought Stan from New York, where just about all the publishers in America were and are, out to Los Angeles or Hollywood? I mean, it was my understanding that that there really were people at Marvel who said, let Stan try to sell it to the movies, which made me think they also didn't want him to be editor-in-chief at the comics anymore.
Yeah.
What do you know about that transition?
Yeah, so Stan's version of those events was always that he wanted to go make it in Hollywood and convinced Marvel to send him out there. And when I say Marvel, I mean I shouldn't say Marvel. At that point, they were owned by a larger conglomerate, but it's hard to say. I'm not exactly sure what the reason, how much of it was them trying to get him out of their hair. But I think a lot of it was just Stan was aspiring to this level of Hollywood success that he had experienced in comic books and really thought he could make a go at it. Now, he'd spent the 70s making a go at it as well, but he had been based in New York and just flying back and forth sometimes. So starting in 1980, he really devoted himself to it full time, as did Cadence, the company that owned them. They invested in Marvel Productions, which was going to be this this entity that would help make Marvel adaptations. Of course, they ended up mostly making cartoons, and the cartoons were mostly the most successful of them were not actually Marvel cartoons. They were Muppet Babies and a number of other things. But anyway,
from that production house. Yeah, I take your point. Now Stan, I mean, when I spoke to him about his Hollywood experiences early on, and then some people who had met him, yeah, I guess it was in the 80s. Everyone enjoyed meeting him. Everyone enjoyed meeting him. He was like a legend, but he didn't seem to have any practical idea for how the stories could work as TV episodes or movies. So in Hollywood, that was considered kind of irrelevant.
Yeah, that was the thing. Was Stan? That gets into the big question that also I can't answer, which was how talented was Stan? You can't really put a numerical value on that. You can't be objective about it. But he certainly was somebody who was very personable, but had a lot of ideas that went nowhere. I mean, you go to the archive and it's astounding the number of pitches and projects that were released but never went anywhere, or projects that were greenlit but never went anywhere. It's amazing. And the ideas, if I may editorialize briefly, ideas are mostly pretty bad. Like they're either derivative or they're simplistic. It's so interesting. He had this hot streak, and the question is how much of the hot streak was really him, how much of it was other stuff, but he really did want to pitch these things. And as you say, even people who liked him a lot would watch him pitch something and say, I don't think he really gets what makes a movie. And, maybe he didn't, that's not a crime.
But as I say, everyone enjoyed meeting him, and he would sign lots of autographs and go to comic book conventions and make a lot of money from attending those. And usually he would sign Excelsior, which I guess means upward or ever upward.
Ever upward in Latin. Yeah. Sorry, were you going to ask something?
So he was a delight to meet. Now, here's the thing. I mean, after there was a bankruptcy in which Ronald Perlman of Revlon owned Marvel, and the way I describe it in my book is basically Ronald Perlman's company just wanted to make money, but wanted to sell junk bonds. So Marvel is a little publishing company. You could just sell lots of junk bonds and get a lot of people to buy the bonds, and then if necessary, you could declare bankruptcy and keep most of the money. That's what happened. They declared bankruptcy. They thought they could keep the company, but instead, two Israeli Americans, Ike Perlmutter and Avi Arad, they swooped down because together they owned a toy company called Toy Biz. Their main business by far was the Marvel characters as toys. They feared that the comic book company would die. But in the end of it, they win in court, but Avi Arad really wants to turn it into a movie company. He meets with Stan, doesn't think there's much there, and says, we got to have a clean slate. And he meets really smart directors who have really good approaches. They sold the Spider-Man rights to Sony, so other people made it, not Marvel. But Avi Arad was always involved, so there was a creative who was thinking about movies, not so much comic books. And so the current Marvel thinking is comic books are kind of the R&D department, in which you can come up with characters, try different storylines. But streaming TV, WandaVision, as spinning out from the Avengers series of movies, they really got it. But I guess it had to be the generation after Stan.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I compare Stan a little bit to Moshe Rabbeinu, you know. I mean, he's kind of a Moses figure in that he really 1998 is when he leaves active duty at Marvel. 1998 is also when Blade, the first successful Marvel movie, comes out. You know, it really was, he came up to the edge of the promised land and was not able to enter. And it's fascinating. It raises all these questions of like, well, why didn't it work while he was still trying? And because when I was talking about the ideas earlier, the core idea of these Marvel characters, these ideas were not bad ideas. I think a lot of that was not so much, you know, there were degrees to which Stan didn't totally get what makes a movie, but also, you know, Hollywood couldn't really pull off at scale a superhero movie in a way that would look good back at that point. I mean, you have this real revolution in special effects that comes in the late 90s. And, you know, you have this real turning point in like 99 with a couple of movies. And then, you know, all of a sudden you can do X-Men, you can do Spider-Man, you can do all of these things.
Yeah, everything looks spectacular. Now, before we turn to the audience for questions, which I think you all can type into your Q&A.
Yes, please.
And Suzanne Borden of Moment Magazine will present them. I just want to give you a couple of minutes. The last third of the book, as I said, is him as a senior citizen trying some non-Marvel things, forming a company, as you said, run into the ground, partner who turned out to be a crook, other partners, other people manipulating him. You know, some of them claim they were incredibly nice to him at home. His daughter, again, accusations fly. Give us the general picture in a couple of minutes.
Yeah, I mean, the short version
yet.
is, right, yes. The very short version is the last third of Stan's life, or the third act at least, was pretty tragic. He, like I said, in 1998, he leaves active duty at Marvel and decides to go start a company with his friend and then, you know, all of a sudden business partner, this guy, Peter Paul. That company, due to a lot of criminal activity, well, first it becomes enormously frothy on Wall Street and looks like it has a bigger market cap than Marvel does. And there's even vague talk about them buying Marvel. And then everything comes crashing down. It turns out there was all this criminal malfeasance. And Peter and Stan never spoke again. Peter went to jail. He went to Brazil and had to get extradited and everything. It's a long story. But then Stan went with some refugees from that company, Stanley Media, formed a second company, POW Entertainment, which still exists to this day as a subsidiary of a Chinese conglomerate. And POW Entertainment was his you know, paycheck other than his pension from Marvel for the remainder of his life from 2001 onward. And POW Entertainment was also has been accused of a lot of shady business dealings. There have been a lot of court
people
cases.
taking advantage of his reputation.
And
I know. And tell me about his home, a little bit
and then
about
his home life.
How you
yes.
penetrated that. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's even more complicated. But there were a series of people who didn't always have Stan's best interests at heart, who glommed onto him, or in some ways really did believe they cared for him, but also believed they deserved some skimming off the top. And, you know, people were really, you get into complicated questions about who exactly was responsible for what, but Stan was in a really bad way and died. I hate that we're ending on this. I mean, I guess we're going to questions, thank goodness. But, you know, when he died, it was a pretty bad situation. So I won't get into all the details, but he was not a happy man in his final months.
Yeah, as I say, that's part of what made the news after he passed in 2018. Again, at nearly age 96. So
a lot happened.
Quite a life, fascinating man, as you heard. True Believer is Abraham Riesman's book about Stan Lee, and Suzanne Borden of Moment Magazine. Did anyone ask any questions?
Yes, they did. Yes,
oh, great.
Thank you both for that fascinating story. And for folks who'd like to buy the book, there is a link in the chat. And so you can find the book there. You can also find, there's a link for Dan's book that he wrote about the story of Marvel being sold. So the first question is, why did you want to write this book? And why do you think it's important to share all of this information, particularly the pieces that are not so flattering to...
Sure. Well, the funny thing is, the book sort of pursued me. The very short version is in 2015, Stan put out a graphic memoir, comic book format memoir, and an editor at New York Magazine where I was working slapped it down on my desk and says, you should do something with this. I start doing research for a profile A week in, he tells me, oh, I meant you should write a capsule review, not do a feature. So I'd kind of accidentally signed myself up for this thing that had not been assigned to me. But to the editor's credit, he was like, well, you seem to be finding some interesting things. Keep going for it. So I wrote this profile of him that was published in 2016 while he was still alive. And then in 2018, when he passed away, again, had moved on to other things. Then I get an email saying that this editor at Penguin Random House, because Stan had passed away, wanted to do a biography of him. And he reached out to me because I'd written this profile of him that was published in 2016. So in both cases, I didn't pitch it. That said, I do think it's important because, look, Marvel is a behemoth. I mean, Marvel, as part of the Disney Corporation, the Marvel Cinematic Universe alone has made more money than the GDP of a lot of small countries. I mean, I'm serious. Like, Marvel is a tremendous and in many ways, toxic force in our economy, in our fictional reality. I mean, I love a lot of it, the stuff that comes out of it, but I felt like it's important to talk about the story behind the story. And, Stan Lee is synonymous with Marvel. And in addition to his life just being interesting and worth recording on the face of it, because he did have such an impact, I felt that it was also important to look at the ways in which this guy who really shaped where the company went, even if he maybe wasn't the main creative force, this guy who made Marvel survive, who he was and what drove him. And a lot of times that was less than savory stuff. And at the same time, also just as a biographer, you have to make these judgment calls. And I feel like there were a lot of times when you couldn't understand the public stuff unless you understood the private stuff. And anyway, so that was, I tried to be judicious, but I saw a lot of parallels, or rather connections, between private and public that
Well, I'm sorry, Abraham, but does that mean you do or don't enjoy shattering idols?
Yeah, right. Oh, geez. I know. It's my burden as an Abraham, but it's not that I thought about it that way. I didn't go into this with an agenda. I mean, there are a lot of people who really hate Stan Lee because they're big Jack Kirby fans. I have no partisanship in that. I also did not grow up idolizing Stan Lee. I knew who he was. I liked Marvel, but he was not somebody I had a parasocial relationship with. I met him one time at a Comic-Con when I was about 13. We include a photo in the book of me meeting him. My mom took it. And believe it or not, this is not made up. When my mom took the photo of me getting him signing a comic for me in 1998, he looks at me, looks at my mom, and he says, "You've immortalized me," which is a very weird thing to say to your future biographer. Anyway, what are you going to say?
Great line.
Someone actually did ask if you ever got the chance to meet him, and were you at other conventions when he was there, and what were their fans like?
Yeah, sure. I'd definitely been to conventions while he was there, including his sort of branded convention, Stan Lee's Comic Kazi in 2015. And look, fans went wild for him. He remained a huge attraction. In his later life, he was a bigger attraction than he had been for a lot of his previous life, because there we go. That's the picture taken by Meg Ross, my mom. But look at that little punham. So anyway, now I forget where I was. What was I saying? I looked at that picture and I went back.
Looks like Prince Harry to me.
For him at the conventions.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah, no, that was a huge source of liquid income for him, was he would go to these conventions later in life after the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the Marvel movies in general had been so popular. And people would line up for, a whole day just waiting to get a signature from him. And
he loved that. In case you're wondering why he was always nice to everybody, he loved being loved.
He loved being loved, but also later in life, then there were people sort of pushing him and he needed the money. Not to get too grim, but this was one of the reasons I got into some of the personal family stuff, was by his own admission, by everyone's admission. This is not just gossip and conjecture. Both his wife, his late wife, and his daughter had real spending habits, and they needed liquid income in order to keep those habits up. And so even late in life, Larry Lieber, his brother, told me a story about getting a call from Stan where they're discussing how exhausted Stan is when he's in his 90s and he's still going to conventions. He's like, I'm dying out here. And Larry says, why you keep doing it? You should just stop. And he goes, I can't, because I need to pay for my wife and my daughter. And, you know, to understand that relationship, you have to understand a lot of things. So anyway, I did not get to meet him really. I went to a Q&A in 2015 that he did at his convention, Kamikaze, and I asked one question it wasn't a Q&A, it was a press conference, I should say. During the Q&A portion of a press conference, I asked one question. And I got to send him some questions via email that were heavily censored, and there were no real interesting answers other than the one that we just mentioned about Jewish New York. So I did not really get to meet him, no. This was what they call a write around.
Right. As somebody did write in to say that they actually worked with him for many years.
Oh,
and they
really?
wanted to note that he was a very kind and generous person, and that
100%.
there's nothing but fond memories of working with him.
Yes, and whoever is saying that, you are not alone in feeling that way. I mean, that's something that I know I got into a lot of the, you know, less savory aspects of Stan in this conversation, but I respect and honor that a lot of people were really influenced by him, either in a parasocial way through reading his stuff or knowing him in person. He was tremendously warm and could be really generous and so on and so forth. And a lot of people had very deep relationships with him.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, humans are humans.
Right. So a few Jewish questions.
Oh,
about
great.
characters. Considering Stanley's assimilationist tendencies, why do you think he made Ben Grimm the Thing Jewish? And then somebody else said that they've read that Peter Parker, especially early on, was heavily Jew-coded, having grown up and lived in a heavily Jewish neighborhood.
Forest Hills, yeah.
Constantly sprinkling in Yiddish. Do you believe that to be, first of all, true? And if you do you believe Peter could have been Stan's outlet for his Jewish identity? Or was Peter more of a collective child of these Jewish immigrants in the industry?
That's actually an interesting way of putting it, that, you know, Stan, of course, was in his late 30s when he's participating in the comics in whatever way he is, when, you know, he's 38 when Fantastic Four #1 comes out. So throughout the rest of the decade, he's in his 40s. So it's an interesting thing to say that maybe Peter was kind of a manifestation of what he believed, a teenager of, you know, like a child of his, he didn't have any boy children, but maybe might have been like, I mean, all this stuff, unfortunately, is conjecture because
but that may not be Jewish, right, Abraham? I mean, it's like he was a New York teenager.
Yeah, it's a New York teenager. I mean, Forest Hills was a heavily Forest Hills was a heavily Jewish neighborhood, and he would say stuff like "for Schluggener" or whatever. But you know, it's like I said, it's conjecture. Stan never said that he was intending. He intended Spider-Man to be Jewish.
And Ben Grimm was a member of the Fantastic Four.
Ben Grimm, who was a member of the Fantastic Four, the Thing, the big orange rock guy. That was a case of him being somewhat Jew-coded. But the question, of course, is, you know, the Fantastic Four, who created them? So Ben Grimm, if Ben Grimm was supposed to be Jewish, if it is true that Jack Kirby created Ben Grimm and the Fantastic Four on his own, then you know, we can't totally give the credit to Stan there. So no, but even then, he wasn't explicitly Jewish. It was all coding. They didn't explicitly call Ben Grimm Jewish in the comics until like 2009 or something. It's crazy.
There was a bar mitzvah or him wearing a kippah.
Yeah, recently he got married. He got married, and they did that. But yeah, up until very recently, he was not canonically Jewish.
Do you think the golem was a factor for superheroes?
You know, again, Shaban beat me to the punch on that, but I'm sure to some extent or another. Again, I always get nervous when I get to the Jewish questions about this stuff, because when you talk about sort of the material conditions of being Jewish in New York, then I have at least some insights. But when it comes to the question of like, well, did this Jewish text influence this Jewish creator? Unless they said it did, it's just looking for parallels, which is something that our people do very well. And often we draw connections that, you know, you can't necessarily back up, but that seem plausible. And I guess I fear going too far down that road. But a golem story, I mean, it gets embedded in your head, and who knows, maybe to some degree or another, that was a big influence on these superheroes.
Great. And a few people just wanted to let you know that you should not store your comics in the basement because of leaks and critters. So
Okay.
move them from the basement.
Thank you. I'll find another place for them. I appreciate that.
So before
Ziploc bags.
Ziploc, yeah, they're bagged and boarded, but anyway, still.
So before we go, the last question that we have for you is, now that we know all that we know about Stan Lee and the creation of Marvel Comics, what do you think is his enduring legacy?
I mean, his enduring legacy is Marvel Comics. Like, Marvel Comics would not be, even if he was not the main creative force there, Marvel Comics would not be a going concern today, most likely, if it weren't for the fact that this, at a time when it was, you know, not to over mythologize, at a time when the comic book industry was not nearly as powerful as it is now. Well, I mean, comic books are not that powerful, but the material from them, when superheroes were not as big a deal, he promoted the heck out of Marvel and wrote incredible dialogue and wrote great letters pages. And whether he was creating the characters or not, Marvel really owes an incredible debt to Stan. It's just the nature of what that debt is that's up for grabs.
Yeah, I mean, Stan absolutely gave Marvel a place in American culture,
an
pop
identity,
culture.
Totally.
And so that's recognized, of course, by Marvel Entertainment, right? As the company's
Marvel. No, now it's yeah, I guess they call
Disney.
themselves that now. I can't remember.
As a division of the Walt Disney Company. But here's the thing, as Abraham noted in his book, in more than a dozen Marvel movies, including the biggest blockbusters, Stan Lee has a little appearance. And you sat in a movie audience where people realize it's him.
Yeah, it's Stan. They start clapping. Yeah, exactly. That's legacy, man. Those movies, if they stick around, people will ask, "Who's that guy?" until the end of time.
Yeah, and I will say,
and maybe they'll buy the book to find out who the guy was. That's what I'm hoping.
I was going to say, I took my daughter to a local convention, and it was exciting. Everybody was so excited to meet him.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you both.
Thank you.
I think this was a phenomenal conversation. We will send out a follow-up email, and we'll have the link, which is both books in the email, though they're in the chat right now if you want to purchase the book right this minute. I want to encourage everybody to go to momentmag.com, where you can sign up for Thursday's program on Israel and Gaza, What's Next, with Aaron David Miller and Natan Gutman. And then next week, we'll be having the program as a reminder on the current state of anti-Semitism in Germany today with Ambassador Haber and Robert Siegel. And we will see you next week again. Oh, and thank you also to the Association of Jewish Libraries for co-sponsoring today's program. We look forward to co-sponsoring more events with them as well in the future. Thank you, Abraham. Thank you, Dan. And we will see you next time.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Bye. Take care.